Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Leah Howard. She is President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Psoriasis Foundation. Today's Kevin MD article is Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform versus Direct Drug Plans. Leah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
All right, so tell us briefly a little bit about yourself and then the events that led you to write this article in the first place.
Sure. So, as you said, Leah Howard, President and CEO of the National Psoriasis Foundation. I've been with the organization since 2012. The NPF is a really fascinating organization. We were started in the late 1960s in Portland, Oregon, by a woman who lived with severe psoriasis. And at the time, there's no internet, there's no way for patients to connect with other people sharing the same challenges they are. And she felt very alone and isolated. And so, actually, as a gift to her for her 30th birthday, her husband put this tiny little ad in the Oregonian that just invited people to call this number to share information. And from that, she got 100 phone calls in the first week and realized there was this real need to connect people living with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis to one another. So fast forward nearly 60 years, we are the largest nonprofit that is supporting psoriatic disease and really driving progress on behalf of this community of about 8 million people. So I've enjoyed the opportunity to do that for many years. I'm a lawyer by background and came here actually to head up our government affairs team. So this article and this work that we're doing to really push for change on behalf of this community is work that's near and dear to my heart and is really a key part of our current strategic plan, which has two goals: finding a cure for psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. And then the second goal is optimizing the health of our community today.
All right, your Kevin MD article is Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform versus Direct Drug Plans. For those who didn't get a chance to read your article, tell us what it's about.
Yeah, so for about a decade, the National Psoriasis Foundation has been leading an effort across the country to improve access to therapies, in part through legislation that puts guardrails around step therapy, which is a very frustrating practice, probably for both your clinician listeners as well as the patients that they serve. And for many people, the frustration of step therapy really comes from the fact that it's driving patients toward a therapy that might not be the most appropriate for them and might not be the one that their clinician thinks, based on their personal health history, they really should be using. So what we've been working to do in partnership with others is to bring this common sense reform first at the state level and now at the federal level to patients, and really through that legislation to put some guardrails, an exception process, some timelines around the use of step therapy. The legislation, both at the state level and federal level, doesn't ban the practices, but really gives both patients and providers the guidance on how to work within a step therapy protocol to get the patient on whatever therapy they think is best. So we've been pushing, as I said, that work at the state level for about 10 years and at the federal level now for the last several, and had a lot of really good progress. Last year, that legislation actually got folded into the Senate version of Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform, which was exciting to see. But of course, we got to the end of the Congress, the end of the calendar year, and that bill didn't pass. So we've gotten the legislation reintroduced, and our advocate network, which includes both patients and providers, has been working to share the information about the value of this bill with federal and state policymakers. What caused me to write this article was earlier this fall, we also started seeing some discussion, both by individual companies, pharmaceutical companies, as well as the current administration, around making more products available directly to consumers. And, I think from our perspective, anytime there's barriers that are standing between patients and providers, that's frustrating. If they can't, cause them to, that actually prevent them from getting patients on whatever treatment they think is best. And so we started watching the conversation that was happening nationally around these direct-to-consumer offerings and noted that there really weren't any patient voices that were a part of that process and that were speaking out on on this topic and thought, this is a really hot issue. This should be something that the patient voice is represented in. And I saw an opportunity here to both comment on, this possibility, these offerings, as well as just remind people of the fact that as we consider new offerings like this, new solutions like this, there are some other solutions that are out there that have been studied and looked at and talked about for the last several years that ought not to be forgotten.
So, for those who aren't familiar with psoriasis treatment and the various options, give us an example of what some step therapy would be, and then give us some example of some of these direct purchase drug programs that we're talking about,
Yeah.
just for those who aren't familiar with the various medications and treatments we're talking about here.
Absolutely. So, psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis are chronic systemic immune mediated diseases. So, when someone's diagnosed with one of those, psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis, that is a diagnosis that they will now live with for the rest of their lives. There's about 8 million people in the US impacted by psoriatic disease. And because it is a disease that presents in different ways for different people, some people have more mild forms of psoriasis, and for them, it may be appropriate to take a topical therapy. For those that have more disease coverage, so more places on the skin, more prevalence of the disease, or disease in those harder to treat areas or more sensitive areas like the face or the genitals, hands, feet, a more aggressive agent would be appropriate. And so that would be something that would be consumed inside the body, either injected or infused or ingested. And so those would be biologic agents, typically are the most well-known systemic therapies. Most folks tell me they can't turn on their TV and not see a commercial for
Yep.
a psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis drug. And it's really amazing how far those therapies have come in the last 20 years since they were first approved. And so typically what happens is a patient will work with their dermatologist or their rheumatologist to get that diagnosis of psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis. And then that specialist will say, you really need to be on a systemic agent, something that can work from the inside of the body out to reduce that inflammation, prevent permanent joint damage, which does occur with psoriatic arthritis. And so they would prescribe one of the more than dozen biologics that are available in our space. And typically what happens is because of the business agreements between pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies, that health insurer will come back to that physician and say, these are the
Yep.
therapies that patient may access that are preferred for that patient based on their health insurance plan. And so the physician might want to go with one therapy, and the health insurance company is saying, no, you need to use this other one instead. And so they have to put that patient on that therapy and see how they do. I think the challenge of this practice is that not every patient is the same and not every treatment works the same. And so for a variety of reasons, a physician or a prescriber might think that one treatment is going to work better or be more appropriate for that patient based on their personal experience with the disease, their overall health history. And what we've been doing with these step therapy bills is really working to put in those guardrails that enable the prescriber to work through the system if something, for whatever reason, does not make sense for that patient to take. Over the last few months, a number of companies, as I said, as well as the federal government, have announced these direct to consumer options where patients will be able to work directly either through the company or through Trump RX to purchase one of these therapies. I think there's still a lot of question marks as to how exactly that will work, how the patient's provider will be kept in the loop, how their pharmacist will be aware of the patient taking that therapy, as well as how the cost sharing will work for patients, which is always an issue. And so there's still a lot of question marks about that process that we'll be waiting to see unfold in the coming months as those are rolled out.
Just so I'm clear, so what's proposed is that patients can now directly purchase some of these biologics,
Yes.
bypassing the drug plan and the physician.
So I presumably they'd have to have a prescription from a physician, but yes, they would be going outside of their plan, outside of the specialty pharmacy that has a contractual relationship with their health insurance company.
And from the perspective of the patient, what are some of the risks of that approach?
Yeah, so we've been getting a lot of questions, not surprisingly, from our patient community about how these would work. I mentioned one of those questions, what'll happen with my out-of-pocket costs?
Hmm.
Will this count against my deductible? Those sorts of things. How will my pharmacist be kept in the loop? There's certainly a question about when people are taking two different therapies, how those therapies might work together inside that patient's body. And for our patient community that has a number of comorbidities, it's really important that they are sharing with both their health professional as well as their pharmacist all the different treatments that
Hmm.
they're on so that there's no worry about contraindications or any adverse events because they're taking more than one therapy. So I think it's a lot of practical questions about how this will happen in practice. And at the end of the day, our role is to really try to drive a conversation forward that's going to be about how we can support some of these system issues. And while this is a big issue for our community, it's also going to impact many other chronic disease communities and is really emblematic of the fact that there's a number of challenges happening right now for patients living with chronic disease within this healthcare system. And I think there's an opportunity for us to really put our heads together to think about better ways to deliver care.
And where are we legislatively in terms of that approach, and how likely is it to come to fruition?
Yeah, so the Safe Step reform legislation that I mentioned has been reintroduced at the federal level earlier this year in both the House and Senate. And so I would encourage your listeners to contact their members of Congress and share more about their experiences with step therapy and how it's impacted their patient communities. So we're hopeful that that legislation will move forward. In this Congress, we've had unbelievable support over the last few years, over the last couple of Congresses for that bill, and have had that legislation passed in more than two-thirds of the state at the state level. And so, as we all know, health insurance is a little complicated who has oversight of that. And so, for marketplace plans, it's states that have that oversight. And that's why it was important for us to pass the state bills. Now, at the federal level, for folks that get health insurance through their employer, we'd like to see those same protections extended to that community as well. And that's why the federal bill is now pending too.
And for those who aren't familiar with the Safe Step Act, just give us some of the highlights specifics that the bill contains.
Absolutely. The two most important things to know about the bill are first that it puts in place a set of exceptions. So it outlines five exceptions that a provider can identify as appropriate for that patient to get around the step therapy protocols within their plan. And so those could be things like this patient has already tried and failed on that therapy under another plan, at another point in time, that the required therapy is contraindicated for them, maybe because of other health history. And so it is a set of five exceptions, is the first part of the legislation. And the second is the timeline. So what it does is puts in place a required timeline by which an insurance company will make a determination of whether that patient can get on to the requested treatment. So 72 hours in typical cases, 24 hours in emergency cases. And this is important because, as I said, these are chronic diseases that are covered by these protocols. And it's critical that we not have a delay between when a patient is seen by a healthcare professional and when they're ultimately able to begin a treatment. And so the 72 or 24 hours ensures that that patient and provider have the opportunity to get that determination and make a decision about how to move forward.
So, if this bill passes, in effect, it will allow the prescriber to directly prescribe biologics to those with psoriasis without getting any pushback saying, hey, you have to try this and this and this first, right?
That's exactly right. And it's not specific to the psoriatic disease drugs. It really covers all of the therapies that a plan might be using these step therapy protocols in. And that's why the NPF has been working in coalition with about 150 other organizations on these bills across the country over the last 10 years. I think there's a number of communities that are really challenged by these utilization management step therapy protocols. And so this would bring relief to many individuals living with chronic disease.
So, where do you see the foreseeable future going forward? You have the potential passing of the Safe Step Act, and then concurrently, you have these direct drug plan models, right?
Right.
So, what do you see the future hold when you have these two competing pathways going forward?
Yeah, we are incredibly optimistic about the future for our community and so many others living with chronic disease. I mentioned the amazing scientific progress that's happened over the last 20 years. When I talk to people in our community that were diagnosed with their psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis in the 80s or 90s, they talk about the frustration of not having options, not being able to manage their disease well, and really living with the shame and stigma associated with that. In 2002, the first biologic was released in psoriatic disease, and it was a game changer. And now, more than 20 years later, these therapies are incredibly safe and effective and do amazing things for this community. In fact, for someone almost regardless of how extensive their psoriasis is, they can get today to clear or almost clear skin, which is just phenomenal. And their psoriatic arthritis can be really well managed as well. So, from a scientific standpoint, we are unbelievably hopeful about the future with patients being able to access and well manage their disease. On the other side, I think, our community really serves as a warning to other disease communities about the challenges of accessing treatments. All the scientific progress in the world, it doesn't mean anything if at the end of the day, people are not able to get on those therapies and use them to the best of their abilities. And so that's why our second goal focused on optimizing health is really centered around those barriers, those pain points that clinicians and patients face when it comes to getting individuals on these amazing life-changing therapies that are available today.
So it sounds like whether it's through the Safe Step plan or these
Yeah,
direct purchase initiatives, it sounds like these biologics are going to be a little bit easier to access going forward for those with chronic conditions.
we're certainly hopeful that, I think that is the aim of our organization and of the patients and clinicians that engage with us in our advocacy efforts. There should be no reason why all this great advancement is not ultimately available to the end consumer at the end of the day.
We're talking to Leah Howard. She is the president and chief executive officer of the National Psoriasis Foundation. Today's Kevin MD article is Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform versus Direct Drug Plans. Leah, let's have some take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Well, so the main thing that I would say is, as I said, it's been an amazing time of progress in psoriatic disease and so many other chronic diseases. And if your listeners are not engaged in advocacy around these issues, if they're not familiar with the success we've had at the state level in getting step therapy bills passed, I encourage you to visit psoriasis.org to learn more about our work and to get involved. We'd love to have you engaged in our efforts.
Leah, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.